All right, so our next assignment we'll be doing is the tracking assignment. So the idea with this one is that we want to add elements into this scene. So if you got to that part of the hologram, do you remember how I took an image and I put it on the computer screen? What did I use for that? Anyone? No? What was that? Corner pin, thank you. So if I take a solid and I use corner pin, I could just line up the corners to get it to line up perfectly with that shape right there. But the problem is, because this piece of footage is moving, that doesn't stay, and it just kind of floats in mid-space. Okay? So this is where tracking comes in, because it allows us to track items in the scene and make them move with the camera. Okay? So there's two kinds of tracking that we're going to talk about. One of them is called planar tracking, and there's a separate program called Mocha. And what I have to do, Mocha is kind of a silly program, I have to export my entire movie out as a sequence, so every single frame gets rendered out as an image, and then I can bring that into Mocha. So that's what I have here. I rendered this out as a sequence. It looks exactly the same, but there's no audio because it's just images. And then if I go to animation, track in Mocha, this will bring up Mocha AE. This is a free program that comes with After Effects, so if you have After Effects at home, you will have this program. You just have to click the button if you wanted to use it. The cool thing about it is that it's very quick. If you have just like one thing you want to add or two things you want to add, it's actually pretty decent. For some things, it's just not what we need. So I'm going to, I'm actually just going to open up my file from before. All right. I have to remember my hotkeys because everything is different. Z and X. There we go. Okay. So in Mocha, this is my footage again. And the way that it works is that I create a shape. So I find something that I want to track. So let's say that I want to track these checks. So I grab the shape, the pen tool here, and I just put a box around it. Now it doesn't matter if I put it right around each piece or if I put it around an entire shape. The idea is what this is going to do is it's going to track a plane. So imagine this is a flat plane, not an airplane, but a flat plane. If it's turned like this, I'd want to draw it along there. If it's drawn like this, I'd want to draw it in that plane, because that's what it's going to track, is the movement of this plane. So I have that shape. And then what I'm going to do is it creates a layer over here, and then I would say track. Now what this does is it goes frame by frame by frame, and it basically looks at the perspective, and it changes that shape based on how this camera is moving. So when my camera rotates, it's going to rotate that shape. When my camera turns, it's going to turn that shape and actually skew it. So what we should see, you can kind of see the little ticker going here, is that it's rewinding back and going backwards, and it's following that shape. Now this is where it's really good for this, because relatively quickly I can isolate an area, say track, and then it'll go and do its thing. The other part that it won't get to is allowing us to basically use this for a lot of other areas. Once I have this plane here, it works great, but if I wanted to do something with the floor, I really couldn't. Like if I wanted to put text right in the bottom of the floor, it wouldn't let me do that because the floor is not being tracked. This serial area is being tracked. Okay? And because all of these are basically in like one flat area, it works perfectly. Alright, so I'm just going to hit stop on this because this is going to go for a while. But now as I move this, you can see how that shape is now moving with those pieces. Okay? So very quickly I was able to track that piece so that now I can create a shape that I can then bring back into After Effects. So inside here, I'm going to turn on my planar surface, and I have to zoom in using the Z key. The hotkeys are right. You only need these two really. You hover your mouse over to this one. There it goes. X is the panning, and then Z is the zooming. Okay. And then I go to my arrow tool, and then I can move this. So what I'm going to do is just move this to what I want to track, or what I want to replace. So I say I want to replace this area right here. And you'll see on the top left of my screen how it's bringing up that extra window. That extra window is showing me a zoomed in image so that I can get right on top of those pixels to make sure I'm right at the corner. There we go. Okay, so now that's lined up. I'm going to zoom back a bit, and you'll see that that new shape is now adjusting with it. At some point, it may scoot away. Right now, it's scooted away because I never tracked all the way past this. If you look at the bar, see how it's red right here? That means it's not been tracked, but the blue area has been tracked further down, or the whatever color that is, periwinkle. So periwinkle area is tracked. It matches up perfectly. If I needed to, I could actually go to the adjust track, and I could set keyframes for this thing as it goes. Sometimes your tracking is not perfect. These things are not perfect. So sometimes you have to track it, draw your shape, and then go every, let's say, 30 frames and just tweak the shape just to make sure it's lined up so that it fits correctly. Okay? All right, so let's pretend that that worked out perfectly. Oops, there it is. Okay, I can see it's off a little bit there, so I am going to adjust this. So I'll just move this over and over. You'll see it added a green keyframe here and a green keyframe there, showing that it has adjusted those points. All right, cool. All right, so now I'm ready. So I can just go to my track and say export. And I can export the tracking data, which is just like the raw data that I could apply to a corner pin. Or I could export the shape data, which would actually create a shape, this big shape right here, that I could bring back into After Effects. Typically, you export the tracking data with a corner pin. So I'm going to say copy this to clipboard. I go back to After Effects. I create a solid. I paste that effect on here. And oops, make sure I'm at the beginning. There we go. And what we'll see is that right when we get to this point here, right at the end, there it is. Now it's all tracked and lined up and perfect. Okay. Now the reason that this is good is because it's super quick. Like, I tracked the piece of footage, I hit the OK button, I brought it back in, and it works. But let's say that I now needed to track the Crispix. I couldn't do that very easily. Even if I took this layer and I pre-composed it, I'll move everything into the new comp. And then let's say I moved it down to Crispix and then I scaled it. You'll see that the footage right there, it kind of looks like it's matching, but then, the second I start moving the camera, it's not going to, okay? So this is good for one-off things. Like, I just want to track this area, I just want to track this area. It works pretty good. What we're going to do is we're going to track a different way. Okay, I want to show that way because it's important to know how this is working. So in the canvas, you'll have a source file that will be a MOV file that is my serial movie. So you do your composition stuff, drag it into the movie folder, bring it in, blah blah blah. You know that stuff by now. You'll grab your piece of footage. And then here's where we went to track in Mocha. We'll go to track camera. And what this is going to do is it's going to actually go through every single frame and figure out how the camera was actually moving in the shot. Okay, before it was basically figuring out how the item was moving. Now what it's going to do is reverse engineer and figure out how the camera was moving. Okay, now I already know, because I've done this a billion times, that the default settings are not going to work. So I'm going to open up the Advanced tab, and I'm going to change this to a detailed analysis. And for my solve method, I'm going to say typical. Okay? If I change those two settings, 95% of the time I'm going to get a good track. After Effects has an OK tracker. There's 5 other programs that are 10 times better than After Effects Tracker, especially because we can export the footage out to other areas. After Effects locks their stuff into After Effects, okay? So what that means is, let's say that I had a 3D item, let's say our hologram one. I moved around Emily while I was shooting, and I wanted to track that data and then bring it into 3D and actually create a 3D model that moved exactly with the camera. I couldn't do that with After Effects. I'd have to go to another program and track and then bring that into After Effects. So what this is going to do is it's going to go through, there's 622 frames. It's going to go through all the frames, and then it'll actually do it backwards too, just to verify its stuff. This little banner here will tell you what stage it's on. Right now it's analyzing the background. Eventually it'll say solving the camera. I'm just going to cancel this because I already have this done. Right here. I lied, that's not it. This is it. Alright, and I'm going to duplicate Serial 2 just so I don't destroy it. Oops. Come on. There we go. Okay. I'm going to delete all the stuff that was in here and just get to that. Okay, so once it's done tracking, this is what I get. So the planar tracker, what it's doing is it's isolating that area and putting basically like little marks all over everything and figuring out where those marks move. So let me turn this off for a second. Right here. So on this box of life, the computer can read the contrast between the dark L and the white background. So what it does is frame by frame, it tries to figure out how that's moving. It also does it right here. It also does it right here. It also does it right there. So imagine like 1,000,000 points on here tracking to figure out how each one of these are moving. Once it figures out how all these points are moving, it can calculate what the camera is doing. And then what we get at the end of this is this. So this is where it's actually found. These are all the points that are available to us, different areas that we could basically put something. You'll notice that nothing on the floor is out here. There's a couple points right there. Like that one is probably a good one. The issue with the floor is that it's reflective, so that as I'm moving, those reflections are basically moving too. So it doesn't like reflections. It doesn't like transparency, so we try to avoid those areas. Another limitation of After Effects is that I can't eliminate that. In some software, I can say, do not track this area, and it'll ignore those areas. If somebody walked down the aisle, it would track that person. In other software, I could isolate it and say, don't track that person. Okay? So what we want to do is we get to this point where we have all of these on here, and I go and I find something that looks like the bullseye is in the same relative direction as the cereal boxes. So if you look at this one, that's pretty close to the relative area of the cereal boxes. This one, oops, that one there is definitely not. Okay? Now I'm not clicking on a point directly, I'm clicking between points. So if I move my mouse here, you'll see it's between those points. If I'm on a point, it doesn't do anything. It has to be between points because it's actually using all three of these points to figure out where that bullseye is located. None of that matters, it's just a matter of making sure that you're kind of looking at that shape. So if I right click right here, I can say create null in camera, solid in camera, and text in camera. So if I just do a null, boom, I get a 3D camera right here, and I get a null. And you'll see the null is super tiny. I can scale this up as much as I want. That's not a big deal. Okay, so we can see it. Then what I want to do is I want to watch it, oops, and see how it moves. So you may have to go frame by frame, just kind of dragging this along and watching it just to make sure that it's still tracked. In some cases it won't be. In some cases it'll move. In some cases you have to pick a different point or tweak it or whatever. This one looks like it is pretty solid. Now if I hit play, the null disappears, which is kind of sucky. But what I can always do is just make a new solid. Go to the position of the null. Go to the position of my gray solid. Make sure that they're both 3D. Yes. And just copy the position of my null and paste it on the position of my solid. Okay, so what that does is it takes that solid and just puts it in the exact same spot. So now when I hit play, you'll see that that layer, that solid, looks like it's locked right to it. It doesn't look like it's wiggling around. If you saw it shaking, that's not a good track. If we saw it kind of like drifting away, that's not a good track. Okay, so let me just show you what would look like a bad track if it was here. You can see how it's kind of like out in front of it, And then as I'm moving, you can see how it's changing what it's placed on. So it doesn't look like it's on top of the boxes. It looks like it's hovering in front of the boxes. Okay, so that's a bad track because I picked, I obviously moved it forward. Okay. So now what we want to do with this is we want to basically make it look like there's some sort of interface. So I want you to add three is the magic number, 3 items to this. I want you to outline one of the boxes and have something fancy happen there. I also want you to have something that is popped out from the side. Okay, so watch how I do this. This right now is locked to that box. Okay, it's like right there. If I take my anchor point for the box and I move it over like this, and I move it up like this, there we go. You'll see how it still stays locked. That corner still stays locked to where it's at. Now if I go here and rotate, I can actually rotate it outward. And what that does is it makes it look like it's sticking out from the shelf. So this is where this is 10 times better than a standard planar track, because the planar track is only giving us that flat area. It's giving the impression of 3D, but not actually 3D. But this, that's, as far as After Effects can do, that's 3D. Okay? So now I don't want just obviously these silly boxes here. I want something a little bit fancier. So like in this one, if you look at the kicks right here, I have more of like a digital interface on top of it. Okay, so it's kind of like, let's say I had a Google Glass on. It's kind of like that Google Glass is like highlighting that kicks box because it might be on my list or whatever. Okay, now to go from here where we've tracked the piece of footage to getting that is not that difficult. It's just a matter of starting off with a null. There's my null. Creating a solid. Now, when I create the solid, I want to basically make something that is the exact proportions of what the box is going to be. I don't know what that is, so I'm just going to guess right now, okay? So I know that the box is taller than it is wider, right? So if I just swap these two numbers, 1080 by 1920, that gives me a tall image. And then if I do the same trick, I go to my position for that. I copy one, paste the other, there it is. I scale it down uniformly, don't unclick this. And this is, again, a good thing about the camera tracker is that we have this ability to move stuff around. So I'm moving that right there. That's with the anchor point. Then I'm just going to actually move the piece up and move the piece over. Now I could go too far and it not track correctly, and that's not a big deal. I just tweak it until it gets there. Then I have to play with my orientation to make sure that it's rotated correctly. So what I'm doing is just kind of rotating and rotating and rotating. There we go. So that looks like it's pretty close to that. No. There we go. So that looks pretty close to the direction of this. Now you can see that my proportions are off. It needs to be wider. Obviously it's too narrow. So if I go to this and I go to my solid settings, I can make this width a bit more. And if you look at it, you can see how as I'm adjusting the width, because I put that anchor point in the bottom corner, it automatically moves it to where it needs to be. Okay, and then I'll move the X, I'll move the X direction over just a smidge, like that. Okay, so that looks like it's pretty close. I want to, again, check it, make sure that it's tracking correctly. That looks pretty good. Sweet. Okay, so now that I have that, I want to pre-compose. So I'm going to say kicks box. I'm going to leave all my attributes here and just go to this other composition that's called tricks box. And this is where I create whatever graphic, whatever image, whatever fanciness I want to add on top of that box. That's what happens here. So I don't necessarily need this, but I could obviously use that. So just so you can see it, if I go to my generate, and I did the 4-color gradient just like we did on the map, and I come back here, you can see there's the 4-color gradient, right? So what I want to do is, we've been through several projects, just make something that looks kind of technological and make it look cool. So a couple things that I did on mine is under generate, there's a couple things like cell pattern you could create. You could create a checkerboard, you can create a grid. I want this to be width slider. There we go. Something like that. I also made a new solid. This isn't what I did on the one I showed, but this is very similar. I also generated, let's say, a noise pattern. And if I take my noise pattern and I turn it to multiply, and then I take my contrast up, I need to take my grids and make them thicker. It's too thick. Oops, sorry, not multiply. There we go. I'm going to color burn. So now we have that grid pattern still. I can go to my evolution, and I can animate this kind of moving and kind of warping in the background. If I hold Alt and click, I can just say time times 30. And that way it automatically sets my keyframes. That's not enough. Time times 80. $160. There we go. So I get some nice movement in there. Now I'm going to make another solid. I'll make a mask on it. Come on, right there. I'm going to feather the mask. I'm going to invert the mask. Oops, I don't want to invert it. I want it to be like that. And I'm going to change my color to black. And what I want to do in this case, oops, hit the wrong button, is I want this to be somewhat transparent. If I jump back to my cereal box, you'll see that it just overrides that. I could play with my modes, so I could turn this to like linear light or add to it, and that'll give me some kind of like neat effect still on top of it, so definitely something I could use. But what I could also do is take this and do a silhouette luma, and what that should do is if I look at my alpha channel, there you go, silhouette alpha, that's what I wanted. It'll take this layer here and basically like eliminate anything that's underneath it. Okay, so it automatically like subtracts it. And the reason for that is that when I get to this stage, I may not want this to be an add, I may want this to just be normal. So I can still see those shapes in here, but I still have transparency right in the center of it. Okay, so you can use some of the same tricks from like the hologram one where we have the lines going up and down it. You could do that. If I jump back to mine here, this is what my shape looked like. So I have this kind of honeycomb pattern. I have these kind of radiating grid lines. I started off with just a blue solid. This didn't do anything. And then I used a, let me solo this so you can see it. Normal. There we go. So I use a turbulent noise, and then I use this hex tile on top of it just to give it some shape. I added a glow to it, and then I used a set matte just to give it some transparency. I don't think I actually needed the set matte in it at that point, though. And then I added a layer on top of it that was turbulent noise, hex tile, and glow again with some curves. And then I did the radio waves, which is what those blue lines are. And what's neat about the radio waves, where'd that go? Is that there is no animation to it. I mean, it's built in, so I don't have to keyframe anything. It just automatically goes. You just kind of like set up what you want them to look like. Wave motion. Radio waves, yes. Inequality, image contours. Oh, there it is, stroke. So I can take this and make it triangle. And these will be more triangular, so they're kind of like pointy, or I can go sawtooth out, or sawtooth in, or a little Gaussian blur, or bell, or sine. And this is how it's creating the stroke profile. And I can play with the opacity or whatever. You just kind of play with the settings until you find something that looks neat. And another radio waves on top of this, just for some added color. And that created that. Okay, so by the time you're done, you'll have one that's kind of like highlighting a box. Once you have that one in place, you could really duplicate it, rotate it. So I'm going to rotate this on the X direction. Nope, on the Y direction. There we go. And then I can make a new comp. So if I go to that kicks box and I just duplicate it, and I alt drag it down to here, now I have a completely different one that I could just put whatever I want on there. So if I just made a little sign that says kicks, spell serial right, there we go. On sale for $34.99. No. It's a world that makes sense where the junk food is more expensive than healthy food. There we go. And then obviously we want this to fill, so we'll put this here, or there. Maybe we'll center these. Right? We could use our...
Cereal is over $30.
It could be. It's gold-plated cereal. On TV, they had a taco that was like $10,000, something like that.
Why?
Why? Because it had gold in it and had truffles and whatever. People are stupid, that's why. Character, opacity, that's what I want. Alright, so I'm going to take the opacity down to 0. I'll set the start point. I'll go up a little bit. Set the end point. I'll make a little box here. Like this. I'll add a stroke to this. Come on. There you go. And I'll add some dashes to the stroke. There we go. And then I want to animate the offset, so it does this kind of thing, like a coupon being clipped. So I can alt-click it, and then the same thing, I'll just do time times 100. Way too slow. 250. There we go. Awesome. Oops. And I'm just going to move my cereal in place. That's good. I'm going to animate this thing coming on. So I'll use a trim path for this. You could use anything for any of the stuff that you're doing. At this point, you should be pretty comfortable with kind of playing around with the tools. So right before the cereal comes on, I'm going to say end. There. so now I jump back to this, and now you can see there's that one. Now, if I want this to be offset, so it starts right there, it starts coming in, but I may want to come in, let's say, right here. I can just scoot this whole thing down until it comes in. There's no actual keyframes on this layer. All my keyframes are inside that comp. All it is position. That's all it is. You'll also notice that my stuff is backwards. So it says kick cereal on sale. It's backwards. So if I just go to my scale, I unlink this, and then I make it -15. It'll flip it, and then I can just move. I might be able to just move my pivot. Yep. Come on. Move my pivot to right there. Okay. Now I want this to be more visible. I'm just kind of showing this for the demo. It fits perfect. I'd probably throw a solid underneath this. Something technological colored. Yep. There you go. But obviously better. The same kind of effect I would use here, I would use there, and just change the text on top of it. So it would say kick cereal on sale. Okay, so when you're done with this, you'll have three things. You'll have whatever you have on one of the boxes, something floating, and then whatever you want to do somewhere else. If you remember the ones I showed before, I forget who it was. Somebody, I think it was Jade. She highlighted one of these that says, stop kidding yourself, just eat donuts. It's pretty funny. All right. So then once you're done with this, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to add your title bumper to it and everything. This video is twice as big. So when you add your title to this, let's pretend that number 7 is my end one. You would drag that to a new comp, and you'd want to resize the comp so that it fits correctly. Because everything we've done is 960 by 540. This was just shot at a higher resolution. There you go. So now it fits perfectly inside the frame. There's my stuff. And then your title bumper would just go, obviously, at the beginning of that, just like before. Okay? This project should only take you probably a week to do. Because the tracking is the longest or the newest thing, everything else is pretty much review of just stuff that we've already done, just applying in a different manner. Okay? So you don't have to go too crazy on this. Just try to make it look digital or technological. Okay? Any questions?
What is the hologram thing?
Today.